It is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's panelists, Senior Strategist Megan Sarachman and Senior Strategist Kelsey Trudiak from Critical Mass. Thanks so much.
All right, I'm just going to jump in and share my screen here. Can everyone see that all right?
Great, thanks Kelsey, and hi everyone and welcome to our talk, What's in a Face? We're going to be talking to you today about our experience with gender bias in feedback and how we use deepfake technology to bring awareness to the issue. But before we get into that, we'll do a couple of quick introductions to Kelsey and I. My name is Megan Sarachman and I'm a Senior Strategist at Critical Mass London.
And I'm Kelsey Trudiak, a Senior Strategist at Critical Mass Calgary.
So for those of you that don't know, Critical Mass is an experienced design agency with a relentless focus on the customer. And Kelsey and I are lucky enough to get to work with nearly 1,000 super talented individuals across 11 different offices. We also get to work on some pretty cool clients. Kelsey and I's focus right now is on Mitsubishi and AT&T.
And so now that you know a bit about CM, let's talk about why we're all here today. This all started about a year ago when Megan and I were speaking at a conference, and it just so happened that our male colleague was also speaking. An interesting part about this conference is that they provide verbatim feedback to attendees. And so when we got this feedback, we decided to analyze the sentiment behind it because the conference started out a little weird for Megan and I. So before we got on stage, I decided to quickly run to the bathroom, and I get a text from Megan saying, direct quote from someone who just walked in, "This is the one with the girl speakers." Right away, people were using our gender as our identifier. And we noticed that this was also prevalent in the positive feedback that we got as well. People felt the need to call out our gender. So the ladies really knew what they were talking about, or the ladies did a great job. And that got us thinking and wanting us to look into the negative feedback as well. And we got comments like this.
I was overly polished and seemed unapproachable.
I wasn't a personal speaker and didn't keep the presentation light and fun.
And we were a little flat and bogged down in spreadsheets, which is a total lie. If you attended this conference, you would know that Kelsey and I actually talked about how much we hate spreadsheets.
And so again, this got us thinking, and we wanted to see, well, what type of negative feedback did our male colleague get as well? And he got comments like, interesting, but nothing mind-blowing. Interesting to hear, but irrelevant to me from a business perspective. Or just needed a little practical application. Right away, we noticed that there was a clear distinction between the type of feedback he was receiving and the type of feedback that we were receiving. His was all about the content, versus ours was about us as people.
So when we started to do some research to figure out whether this was just a Kelsey and Megan problem or if anybody else had actually experienced similar things in feedback, we found out it's actually a thing. Women are actually 1.4 times more likely to receive critical subjective feedback instead of critical objective feedback. And you can guess which type of feedback is much more constructive to receive.
We dug into this even deeper, and we found that 76% of women get negative personality feedback in reviews, compared to only 2% of men get that same negative personality feedback. That's a pretty stark contrast in the type of feedback that men and women are receiving within their professional lives.
So this only gets worse for women of color, where in performance reviews, women of color are actually required to prove their own competence in performance reviews 4 times as often as men.
And so this is a huge issue, especially within our industry, because we work in a very subjective industry. And if we're not getting that constructive feedback to help push ourselves to be better, as well as our work to be better, then how are we going to grow and continue to climb that corporate ladder like we want to? Our work suffers and our clients suffer because of it.
So an example of how this bad feedback manifests itself in our professional lives is something called the broken rung problem. So we all know that women are less likely to be promoted than men. Unfortunately, I think that's just common knowledge now. But the biggest gender disparity actually happens really early on in our careers when we're trying to make that first jump up to a managerial position. Researchers at McKinsey actually found that while entry-level employees, about 48% of them are women, only 39% of that total actually progresses on to a managerial position. And that's compared to 59% of men. So basically what that means is that for every 100 women that get promoted, an extra 30 men get promoted on top of that. And as you can imagine, by just looking at the slide that Kelsey has up here, that gap becomes even wider for women of color. This gender difference is actually so great that the researchers at McKinsey have said that this broken rung problem is the single greatest obstacle that women face on their path to leadership in their entire careers.
And so it became crystal clear to us that we all still have an inherent bias. And so Megan and I got to thinking, what could we do about this problem? And we decided that the best approach was to give ourselves a platform to talk about this. And we decided to do this by using deepfake technology to turn ourselves into dudes. So we would take the same talk, the same presenters, just give them different genders. And so that's why we got to introducing Kevin and Mike. And as I mentioned, it was the exact same talk we were doing, the exact same presenters, but Megan and I got deepfaked into Kevin and Mike. And our plan was to release these videos to the public and let the comments roll in to see if the feedback we were getting was actually biased and if there was a discrepancy between the type of feedback that Megan and I were receiving compared to Kevin and Mike.
So a bit of a spoiler alert here before we go on with the presentation. Kelsey and I had some really grand expectations for how we were going to use deepfake technology to turn ourselves into dudes. But with great expectations came a pretty healthy dose of tech reality. And so what we're going to walk you through in the next few slides is explaining exactly how we use deepfake technology to turn ourselves into dudes and what learnings we have from that process. So before we get into too much detail, though, let's just take a step back and understand exactly what a deepfake is. So a deepfake is the outcome of artificial intelligence seamlessly swapping two people's faces and voices in video using something called deep learning neural networks. And I know that last part sounds like a bunch of jumbled up words together, but we'll explain what it is later on.
But before we explain what it is, I just want to highlight that this technology is something that I'm sure all of you have experienced so far in your lives. Whether it's Snapchat lenses making you look young or super old, or whether it's the face swap feature on TikTok, or even watching political videos of Obama or Zuckerberg saying something that they've never actually said before. All of these are things that you've probably experienced thus far, and you're only going to see more of them popping up because this technology is becoming more and more prevalent. But let's actually talk about how this works. And so we'll take about a 10,000-foot view and look at it more holistically for you guys. So you can see on the left here, there's images of myself and James, my male counterpart within this experience. And so what we do is we take a lot of footage of myself and James, and we input it into the system or the AI algorithm that we call neural networks. By intaking all of this video footage, the AI algorithm can actually learn from it. And so it can start identifying things like, is our face turned a certain direction? Or are we smiling or frowning? Or in James' case here, making a funny face in this image here. All of that, it can start learning from it.
So basically, once the neural network has taken in all this different video and footage of Kelsey and James, started to memorize what they look like and how they behave, what the neural network does is it's being trained on this footage to replicate different frames from that footage of Kelsey and James. Now, this replication that it's doing is called latent space, and that's what you can see in the middle of the diagram here. Latent space becomes really important with deepfake technology because that's ultimately how the deepfake is made. So what will happen is that we'll take the latent space of James's face and his movements, and we'll essentially expand that into the latent space of Kelsey. And what you see is that the result is on the far right-hand side. This is Kelsey's deepfaked dude version of Kevin. Basically, it's Kelsey's body, Kelsey's talking, Kelsey's facial expressions, but it's James's face saying them. Now, when Kelsey and I first started this project, we were by no means deepfake experts or really well versed in how artificial intelligence works with this technology. But by doing a lot of research, finding the right partner, and just being really open to learning and adapting our process, we were able to execute this properly. So we're going to walk you through what our steps would be to conduct deepfaking. The very first one is just finding a really amazing partner. So finding a partner is so critical because deepfake technology is so new, it's constantly evolving, and there really isn't a how-to manual on Google that you can look up and do this yourself. Kelsey and I have definitely tried. And so what we ended up doing was approaching a really brilliant deepfake technologist called Dr. Fakenstein, who has been following this technology and using it for a number of years. Once he agreed to say yes, we were kind of off to the races. And this, while he may not be particularly famous, by name, you might have seen his videos online. He actually deep fakes Nick Offerman's face into different TV shows and movies. My personal favorite is the Full House rendition, but you can check out his Instagram page to pick for yourself. They're all really hilarious. So once we were able to pick a partner successfully in Dr. Fakenstein, our next step was really to find two men's faces that we could borrow and deepfake onto our own.
Yeah, so when we were looking for lookalikes, Megan and I had to do a little bit of light stalking, is what we call it, of our male work colleagues on Slack to see who had similarities to us. So who had similar face shapes, body sizes, hair color, skin tone, because we wanted to limit the number of variables that the neural network had to learn. And we wanted to mitigate as many risks as we could so that the video came out as realistic as we could make it.
So the key to deepfaking is really in the video that you feed it, so the quality and the quantity. And it's also in how the AI manipulates the audio to match the person who's being deepfaked. So starting with the video front, it's really important that you're feeding the AI algorithm as much angles, expressions, and emotions of the people being deepfaked as possible so that it has enough video footage to train itself, and therefore the output is a lot more realistic. Something that we would really recommend if you are going down this deepfake route is to make sure you consider emotions as a part of your video footage. Extreme emotions do different things to people's faces and the expressions that they make. And being able to represent that in what you're feeding into the algorithm is only going to make the deepfake that much more realistic. What we like to say with this piece is that you really get what you put into it. And so if the video footage is good and you're giving it enough information to be trained on, then the output is just going to be that much better.
And the next piece of the puzzle, as Megan mentioned, is audio. Dr. Fakenstein, who we're working with, is an expert in video, but doesn't do as much audio work. And so we worked with one of our audio engineers at Critical Mass to look at manipulating the video. So we didn't actually do an audio deepfake, but rather we manipulated that video. But throughout this experience in trying to learn what are the key differences between men and women's voices, there are a few elements that came to our attention. The first is, as I'm sure you know, women tend to have a bit of a higher pitch to their voices than men. On top of this, though, men tend to use volume to actually emphasize points versus women use pitch more frequently to emphasize those same points. Another big area that we learned within this is something called frequency bumps. And so what that is that depending on your chest cavity, your sinus cavity, or your skull, there's resonating that exists within that. And the larger the cavity that the sound is resonating within, the lower ranges that your voice comes out. So men tend to have larger chest cavities and therefore have lower ranges, versus women tend to have smaller chest cavities and therefore have higher ranges. And so all of these elements were things that we had to take into account when we were looking at manipulating mine and Megan's voices and changing them into realistic men's voices. And so all of this kind of led us to a process where we had to learn and adapt, because as Megan mentioned, there was a lot of elements or roadblocks that we faced when we were going through this process. And so I'm going to show you an example here of a visual test that we did. This doesn't have any audio manipulation, but this was our first try at deepfaking the video footage. All right, welcome. We're going to be talking through our new webinar series. 5 things that you can learn about digital experience, and today we're going to be covering AI and how customer experience has changed. So first off, you can see there are some flags right off the bat. Megan was in London when we were doing this trial period, so we got Martine, one of the other women in our office, to sit in. And she is quite a petite individual. So when we deepfaked Cody's face onto her, it tended to look a little bit bobbleheady, you can see on the one side of the screen. So again, we had to make sure that face shape and size was something that was a little closer. You can definitely change this within the process. It just takes a lot of effort on that Dr. Fakenstein would need to go into and change things to try to get that face shape more consistent with Martine's. However, it worked out for us based on the body size that we had. As well as you can also see within these videos, you can see a large portion of Megan and I's bodies, or mine and Martine's bodies. And so we realized that that's going to be an issue when we're turning into men. So we cropped in a little tighter to try to limit what's being shown within the video itself, as well as we also got more footage and more angles because there's areas that are a bit blurry within this video that we noticed. And so this is the final product.
Gender bias in the workplace.
It's a thing.
Men get feedback about the content they present.
Women get feedback about themselves.
To shed some light on the issue, we turn to deepfake technology.
So I want you to read this one first.
I read what he said?
Yeah, that's what he said.
Oh, God.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. Welcome to our brand new webinar series, Digital Deep Dives in 5, where we're going to be looking at trends that are happening in the digital
Same
space.
talk, same
Today, we're gonna be
presenters.
talking about how
Different genders.
Is impacting customer experience and what brands.
To get the transformation right, we brought in an expert.
We discovered pretty quickly we had a lot to learn.
Less movement,
More angles,
more emotion,
less man buns. Got it.
we made these adjustments, but found a new obstacle to overcome.
Our voices. Our audio engineer did a deep dive and identified what really makes a voice sound male or female.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. Welcome to our brand new webinar series.
But even after applying these changes and more, the technology still wasn't meeting our expectations.
Thanks to a bunch of trial and some error too, we realized there's still a lot for us to learn.
But what it comes down to is that as a digital agency, we have two jobs.
One is to push our technology forward and make it better.
The other is to push ourselves to be better.
So as Kelsey mentioned, there was quite a bit of learning and adapting that we needed to do in order to get to that final version or output. And I'd be curious, I know everybody's on mute right now, but if anyone felt like a little bit uneasy when they saw the test version or even in the final version, felt a little suspicious or uncomfortable, because if you did, that's actually not uncommon, and it is the result of something called the uncanny valley effect. So the uncanny valley effect is a scientific study or concept that basically says that technologies that try to replicate or resemble human beings make real human beings that are watching it feel really uncomfortable and uneasy without a real explanation as to why. And so when we actually went out and tested this final video with a group of people that had no prior knowledge of the project at all, the feedback we got back from them was very much in line with this uncanny valley effect. A lot of them, had comments at the end saying, this is a great webinar, but something feels a bit off, something feels a bit weird. Nobody outright identified that we were deep faking ourselves into men or that something was potentially completely off and we were tricking them. It was just something didn't feel right and it made them feel uneasy. And that's part of the reason why we couldn't actually execute our project as we'd originally intended.
Yeah, and we noticed that there were kind of 3 main areas that were triggering this uncanny valley effect. So the first are our voices. As I mentioned, we simply manipulated the audio. We didn't actually do a deep fake. So the audio did come across quite digital. And that element could be something that was triggering that sense of unease within individuals when they watch the video. The next is our appearance. So no matter how many bobby pins we put in Megan's hair to try to pin it back into a men's hairstyle, and believe me, there was endless bobby pins in there, or how we tried to make my hair look like a convincing man bun, people just flagged that it didn't necessarily appear as genuine as they would have liked it to, and something felt a little bit off about it. And then finally, our mannerisms. If you haven't noticed throughout this video, Megan and I are a bit of hand talkers. So there was video footage of us where our hands would come into view, and they didn't look like you'd expect. They were a lot smaller than what you would stereotypically see in a man. So that was something that people had flagged, as well as we tried to limit our movement, but still there were elements in how we acted and behaved that something felt off to people when they watched the video. And so all of these reasons were why we didn't necessarily release the video, but we wanted to still share our experience with you guys so you could learn from it.
So we don't want you to leave this presentation feeling like, deepfake technology doesn't work or it's not relevant, because Kelsey and I do see quite a number of really amazing applications for us in a marketing and creative field. And the technology is constantly getting better. A lot of these applications are actually in practice today. And I'm just going to walk you through a couple of examples of things that really resonated with us when it comes to deepfake technology use. So the very, very first one is around language and voice dubbing. So I'm not sure if any of you have seen this public service announcement that David Beckham did to raise awareness for malaria, but what they were actually able to do was deepfake him speaking 9 different languages. It's extremely seamless. You can barely tell that it's a deepfake. And it just shows that there's a real use case for deepfake technology to help us localize different content, different languages in a way that doesn't feel glitchy or unnatural. The second really amazing application is through video takes, editing, and makeup. You can see here that there is a young Paul Rudd and an old Paul Rudd side by side, and the old Paul Rudd was actually completely deep-faked. And so a real application for this in productions and shoots, instead of having actors have to sit through like hours of extreme makeup, this could actually be really seamlessly done using deepfake technology. Another area here is just around production efficiency. So if there's small edits that need to be done to a particular bit of footage, this can be, again, done using deepfake technology instead of having the entire production team called back in to make a minor reshoot of a particular scene. 2 other areas that we've seen that are actually pretty exciting in terms of like advertising is dynamic creative optimization, as well as deepfake music. Deepfake music is really interesting because like 6 months ago when we completed this project, audio and deepfaking wasn't as advanced as it is now. You can explore the example on the right-hand side here of Jay-Z and Shakespeare. It's almost completely seamless, but that wasn't something that was available to Kelsey and I 6 months ago. And so it just shows how quickly this technology is changing and how much better it's getting every single day.
And so throughout all this, and just kind of to summarize, we realized that unconscious bias is systematically ingrained in all of us. And even though, as Megan mentioned, there were limitations to the technology that we had to deal with when we were doing this project, we still wanted to share it with everyone, because when you know better, you can do better. And so that way you can understand where your unconscious bias lies, where other people's lie, and you can take some of these tips and tricks and try to use this technology for good.
So we hear all the time how companies are trying to be better. Harvard actually uncovered that about 42% of companies actually check for gender bias in performance reviews, which is really amazing. But when we start to look at companies that actually track the outcomes of that gender bias in reviews, that number drops down to about 18%. And unfortunately, like being able to actually track the outcomes of that are where the change actually happens. And so Kelsey and I were thinking to ourselves, how can we actually turn unconscious bias into conscious bias so that the same thing doesn't happen to other people that happen to us? And so the really key thing here in moving unconscious bias to conscious bias is self-awareness and being really committed to change. And so there's 3 key tips that we would give in order to make that movement. The very first thing is check yourself. The second thing is test yourself. And the third thing is track yourself. So let's start with check yourself. The very first step is just understanding that you're probably not completely unbiased. Harvard has this really amazing online implicit bias test that you can take. So that way you can self-assess to see how subtly biased or maybe not so subtly biased you are across 15 key areas. And that's because gender actually isn't the only area.
And I'm sure you noticed when you got an invitation to this talk or sent a link, we did send out also a link to the gender and career implicit bias test. So if you haven't already taken it, please do. It's great to kind of understand where your unconscious bias lies, because when you're aware of it, you can start making those adjustments. You'll notice that Megan and I in this talk primarily focused on gender and touched on race as well, but there are a ton of other categories that this implicit bias test recognizes. There's age, LGBTQIA, and disability, as well as some other areas as well. So feel free to check that out and see where your unconscious bias lies, or urge other people to check it out as well. The next area that we recommend doing is testing yourself. And a great way to do this is flip it to test it. So before you give feedback, take a look at that feedback and reflect on it. Is this something that I would say to my male counterpart or someone from another affinity group? And if it isn't, then you shouldn't be saying it to them. So this is a really important way to make sure that you're not providing biased feedback to people, as well as you can do the same when you're receiving feedback and see if someone would give that same comment to a man or, again, someone from another affinity group.
So let's look at some examples here. In performance reviews, women will often be labeled with negative feedback for the same behavior that a man would be praised for. So you can see some words on the right-hand side of the screen here. One big example is arrogance. So women will be labeled as arrogant for the same behavior that a man would be praised as being confident for. A man might be labeled as really thoughtful, but again, a woman would be labeled as indecisive for that exact same behavior. And then the final one that is probably the most loaded word in a performance review for a woman is emotional. Women will also get labeled as being emotional when the same behavior in a man would be labeled as passionate. So emotional is a bit of an interesting word because depending on if you're a white woman or a woman of color, that word actually changes. So women of color will often be labeled as irrational or even angry for, again, their male counterpart being labeled as passionate. And so you can see that these two sets of terms on the left and right are absolutely so polarizing that it's really not surprising that that broken rung step up to managerial positions for women becomes that much harder. We really need to follow Kelsey's advice here in flipping it to test it. You need to think to yourself, would I ever call a man emotional in a performance review? Would I ever call him arrogant or indecisive? If you wouldn't, then you probably shouldn't be giving that feedback to a woman. Now let's get into the very final tip, which is track yourself. So track yourself is probably the most important tip that we can give to organizations because it's really critically important that we are working with real data to track our progress against set targets. This is something that we always preach to our clients around KPIs, and this is something that organizations need to do as well. Without this tracking, we're not actually able to see whether women and women of color are being treated equally to their counterparts in reviews and in feedback.
So where can you find this information and this data? And there's 4 kind of main areas where you need to look for it. The first is in performance reviews. So are you providing your work colleagues with biased feedback? Again, flip it to test it to check. Or are you receiving biased feedback within that, your performance reviews? And if organizations start tracking this, then they can identify if there's a problem and there needs to be training done to help with that issue. There's a lot of tools out there for organizations that you can actually hook up to your performance reviews that will start flagging biased texts or comments and ask people to rework them and make them more actionable and more beneficial to the person who's receiving them. The next area we need to look at is the rate at which they're hired. So, are men and women, for example, hired at the same rate within your organization, or someone from another affinity group? If you're tracking this and measuring it, again, you can identify if there's discrepancies in the number of people that are being hired within certain categories, and look at your HR hiring practices to see if they need to be adjusted or other things need to be looked at within your organization. The third is the velocity at which they're promoted. And this relates back to that broken rung theory that Megan was talking about earlier. You need to track the velocity at which people within your organization are being promoted, especially at that entry level to managerial role. You can assess if women and men or other affinity groups are being promoted at the same rate. And again, if they aren't, you can look at what levels of your organization need to be adjusted and what practices you need to change within your organization to make sure that people have those same opportunities and are climbing the corporate ladder at the same rate. And then finally, the last one is holding leaders accountable for progress on these diversity metrics. Again, if they're not even keeping track of them, this is an issue, because how can you elicit change if you don't know if you have an issue within your organization? And so measuring and tracking and keeping your leaders accountable for these diversity metrics is something that's extremely important. And one way through our research that we actually saw organizations have some success with this is to monetize that process, which is really interesting. So, in summary, I know we've thrown a lot of information at you guys, but as a digital design agency, Megan and I feel like we have two main jobs. The first is to push technology forward and make it better. And even though it didn't necessarily work out as we'd planned with our Deepfake project, we still believe that that's something we need to continue to do. And the second is to push ourselves to be better. Because again, when you know better, you do better. And so with that, we wanted to say thank you from the girl speakers. And before we get into the question period here, we just wanted to take a minute to thank our team. We couldn't have done it without them. They were a vital part of this project and putting everything together, whether that's letting us borrow their faces or doing excellent design work like Tyler Wong did. All of them are valued members of the team, and we really appreciate all their effort. So I will stop screen sharing so we can jump into questions now.
Amazing. Thanks, Kelsey. So it looks like we have a few questions here. We'll start off with this first one. The question is, what do you see as downfalls of deepfake technology, since it does have a bad reputation, especially on social media? So that's a really good question. It's actually something that's come up a lot throughout this project for us, is the ethical implications of deepfake technology. But what we always come back to with this technology is that no technology is inherently evil. It's all how people use it. And so that's why we felt it was really important in this presentation to call out those really relevant applications for deepfake technology in marketing and creative. There's obviously quite a few really terrible deepfakes out there that are trying to spread misinformation or paint certain people in a bad light. Even blackmailing has been used. But we really, with this project, wanted to make sure that we are showcasing this really brilliant technology in a positive light. It can be used for good and for change, instead of all of the really inherently evil things that it's been used for in some cases in the past.
The next question is, if you could do this project again, what major changes would you make to this execution? So I think one of the major changes we would make is bringing in an audio deepfake expert as well to help with the audio elements, just because our internal expertise, even though they were great and our audio engineer tried really hard to manipulate them, it just wasn't as convincing as we would like. There's also things within the visual elements that we would definitely look at changing based on our research, just seeing how mannerisms, how the difference in pitch in voices, as well as visual elements like the hair, maybe we would get wigs to make that less convincing. So I think there's a lot of different elements within changing our appearance and how we would adapt that and implement new changes to make the video more convincing, as well as the audio expert being brought in, that I think are changes that could have made it, or made the uncanny valley effect not necessarily be as big as a problem as it was in this.
Great. So another question we got here was, have you noticed those closest around you making a much bigger effort to be aware of gender bias? That's actually a really good question. And, we've done this presentation internally a couple times just to, let our organization know what we're working on. And we have had people come up to us afterward essentially saying that they had no idea that this was even a thing. And I think that's something that we found throughout our research as well, is that a lot of people giving feedback, they don't set out to be rude or like giving unconstructive feedback. It's all unconscious, this bias they have. And that's why some of our tips are really around that self-awareness and being really committed to make that change. Because there's even been cases where Kelsey and I will be giving feedback in our 360 development cycles thinking, is this piece of feedback about them as people, or is this a piece of feedback about their work and what they're contributing? Because it's an important distinction. And when you've been taught to do something a certain way your entire life, it is going to take some conscious effort to get out of that pattern.
The next question is, do you have any suggestions on sharing this with colleagues or bosses who you feel could benefit from this without them getting defensive? I think there's several different ways to do that. And I think you can bring it to attention, not just from your perspective, but also from the perspective of other minority groups, because obviously this extends beyond the issue of gender. And there's a lot of different issues that exist. And Megan and I, CM is excellent with this, but we also flagged all our research with them, and they've done excellent steps to try to track all this and do what we talked about in those 4 steps. But I think first off, just having a casual conversation about it, even if it's just bringing up those key stats that we've presented to you through this presentation and say, hey, I saw something interesting in a presentation. Do we do anything within our organization to help track this and to mitigate this issue? Because it looks like it's a pretty prevalent problem within society today. And just make sure you're not using accusatory language and rather taking actionable steps to make it better. I would say would be the best way to kind of bring it up and just frame it in interesting information that you've seen. But again, there's a lot of different ways that you can share this. And I think it also depends on the relationship that you have with your boss or other people in the organization and how you go about that. So it's a bit personal as well.
Great. So another question we have here is, great presentation. Any major differences in the way each gender gives feedback? Clearly females receive it very differently than males, but I'm curious if any findings on how they provide it. So that's another really good question and something that we've had to explore throughout this project. A lot of people make the assumption based on the stats that we show that it's all men giving women this really shitty feedback. But actually what we found is it's actually quite equal parts like female and male. So we aren't, out here saying that it's one particular gender doing that. It's both. And I think what's really important here is just, again, self-awareness that it's not just men giving this type of feedback, it's women giving women that type of feedback. And we've even had women come up to us after seeing some of these stats and talk about, how they had no idea they were giving feedback in this way and how unconstructive it is. And so I think it's important that, we're not pointing fingers at one particular group of people, because ultimately unconscious bias really does affect the larger group. And it's just important that we are aware of it and are actively committed to making a change to make sure that this type of feedback doesn't continue on for all of us, for our careers.
The next question is, do you think this technology has been fast-tracked during COVID to make up for the difficulty of filming together in a studio? I think just even in the past 6 months, the technology, there's so many different pieces that have come to fruition and so much more attention on it. So yes, I believe it has been fast tracked and it's just continually and exponentially growing. So we have seen new things like that, deepfaking music or things like that are coming to be now. And I think that it is an interesting solution to the not being able to film in studios element. I know these are conversations that we've had internally at CM in ways that we could potentially leverage this technology so that we didn't have to go in studio and people weren't put in risky situations with production. So I think just based on my personal experience and what I'm seeing online and it becoming more and more common, that I do think it has been fast track and more people are looking at this as a solution to COVID and not being able to shoot things.
That's great. So another question we have here is, could you share a bit about the timeline? How long was pre-production? How long did it take from the recording of you speaking to final video with the deepfake? So I think for pre-production, we spent about a month just making sure that we could test the video, get a deepfake version back that we were comfortable with and was going to be realistic enough to meet the objectives of our project. After that, it was another, I think, a couple weeks for us to actually shoot the webinar, quote unquote, that we were using. And then after that, it took Dr. Fakenstein about a month to actually deepfake us. And that's including like iterations and changes on that video. So in terms of production for its entirety, it was probably 2.5 months.
As this project was done in North America, have you thought of any cultural differences that may impact the results of a study like this elsewhere? Obviously, cultural differences are a huge thing that need to be considered. We were specifically designing it for a North American audience, so we didn't look into as much detail as the cultural elements that exist because we weren't submitting it within those countries. But I think that is a really excellent point, because a lot of people do have those elements to consider. One thing that was a conversation that came up with us internally was how this could potentially affect the LGBTQIA community. And we had conversations with a lot of individuals that identify with that group to understand if there were different societal or cultural implications of this presentation and what we were doing. So we did have those conversations, but we didn't have conversations about the cultural differences in other countries.
Great. All right, so I think this is our last question here. How do you think as a recipient you address those unfair performance reviews without continuing to come across as emotional and irrational? So that's another really good question. I think, just speaking from our own experience at CM, it's all about being just open and honest and stating facts. For us, like there's been opportunity to speak to a lot of people at our organization on how they're tackling some of these things in performance reviews. And some of the things that we brought forward to them are there's actually like technology that's out there that will actually screen different feedback for gendered language, or even some of the words that I covered in examples around arrogance and irrational. So there's technology solutions to this, but I also think it's just being open and honest with whoever your career developer or performance manager is, and stating facts around what you believe is right and what you believe isn't right. That's gotten Kelsey and I actually quite far within CM, and they've been very open and receptive to any of this research and what we found.
Perfect. Since we're all working remote and using webcams, do you think this could be used to have people check themselves specifically now? So I think that any time is the time to have conversations like this. And I think, sure, webcams are a great kind of opener to the question, but I think there isn't necessarily a specific time or event that allows this conversation to come up. So I would say that anytime you can encourage people to take the unconscious bias test and do that is a great thing, as well as if we're looking at actually deep faking and we're talking about webcams and deep faking, I do think, as we mentioned earlier, that has kind of amplified the situation because people are becoming more aware of the capabilities of this technology. So I think that has also, again, been something that can help you bring up this conversation as well as use this technology. Hopefully I answered your question there.
Cool. So what are your thoughts on bias preventing hiring procedures? For example, hiding the names of applicants before passing them on to recruiters or hiring managers. I think that those are all really great applications. Something that Kelsey and I have found during our research is that there's often like a lot of focus put on how we're maintaining, equality and diversity at the entry level, but there's not enough emphasis put on how does that translate as people move up in an organization. And that's why that feature that we talked about around the velocity at which people are promoted is something that also needs to be really thought of and addressed. I think that those are both really great ways to, make sure that diversity is being successfully executed at the entry level, but there's just a little bit more thought that needs to go into how do we make sure that people are treated equally in their performance reviews as they move through the organization, are being promoted, and that kind of thing.
Any good ways to tie these important diversity and gender metrics to pre-existing KPIs? So that is something we actually looked at. If we had released these videos on LinkedIn, we were potentially also going to look at video view rates and if different genders had people watching the videos for longer portions of time, or releasing an ad that triggered people going to a specific video or another video, and seeing if an ad with male candidates versus female candidates got higher click-through rates or conversion to set something up or get an email for webinars in the future, and seeing if either of the genders drove higher KPIs within that. So that's definitely one way we looked at connecting KPIs to this issue, and then being able to release those performance metrics after the fact, to just share with people the implications that that unconscious bias has on their interactions online as well.
Great. I think this is the very last question we have here. So, oh, and it's disappeared now. Oh no, here it is. Sorry, guys. What action items should women in tech take to be taken seriously in their role? So I think this is probably a pretty subjective answer that I'm going to give. It's been, based on my own personal experience, but the things that I've always found is to build up my credibility is, again, just making sure that you're constantly aware of like what's going on in the industry, so you can, when you do speak up, you are heard and have something to say. I think something else that's really important to make sure that you're being taken seriously is just to be yourself. Like I don't think that there's any, checklist that we can give out that says that, this is how to build credibility, other than just be yourself, work hard, and make sure that you are making your voice heard. A lot of the people that we've spoken to after presenting this project have said, they haven't like had that voice to speak up. And I think that it's just important that you're able to feel comfortable and confident enough to make sure that you're having your opinion heard. So I don't know, Kelsey, if you have anything to add to that from your perspective, because I know it's a pretty subjective answer.
No, I think you covered it pretty well, Megan. I would say my experience has kind of been similar to yours, obviously, based on kind of all of this. So yeah, I agree with you there.
Great. So I think those are all the questions we had for the presentation.
Thank you, Megan and Kelsey, so much. What an insightful presentation. I think it's so important that we recognize our own biases, be more mindful about the feedback we give. We are going to share this recording in our follow-up email. I just want to say thank you all so much for joining us today. Please visit oneclub.org for more upcoming programs and panels, and we'll see you at the next one. Be kind to yourselves and each other. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.